Before we do the real new stuff from last time, I'm going to squeeze in since we ran out of tape. If you recall, we were talking about this place, a little story of this place that once a month they laugh aloud to people to fully realize, even verbalize, but fully realize the primary energies and aspects and purposes behind all of their secondary activities. Also consider, in light of this also ever popular ordinary activity, and that is a great intrigue for the noble savage, for less civilized people. Been going on, I keep pulling up poor old Jacques Rousseau and slapping him around, but even the Romans and the Greeks, considering themselves civilized, they had other people. The Spartans, that they thought, boy, what a bunch of crudos, except many of them, since they didn't have a Club Med, thought, wouldn't it be nice to be able to live like that? Instead of having to raise our little nippers that don't look all that healthy, they really got something, just throw them in the river, that kind of stuff. There has been a lifelong, horizontal, ordinary intrigue in humanity for the savage. We've mentioned it before, and there are several ways to look at it, but consider one of them, that the more civilized you are, and it's always that case. If right now, if we were to pick and say that there is Paleo Town or land and 2000ville, that is, that the past and the future, of course, is still extant in everyone, and we don't have to look for actual lands outside you because they're in your nervous system, but they're still on. But the higher, I'm using 2000ville as being like the highest end of the ordinary nervous system, the development of the brain. The higher it is in the ordinary sense, the more it is potentially intriguing back in Palean land, Old Town. Do you follow? That the more civilized you are, speaking generically or for a whole group, the more civilized they are, the more they're in the secondary world, the more potential there is for them to have at least a passing interest, if not fascination, with the other direction. And they even attempt to explain it, that well, all you got to do is turn on PBS, and somebody with several PhDs, somebody with credentials, will be going back to do some kind of research on the Amazon or some godforsaken place. That's their term. I didn't. But along the way, they cannot run a 55-minute show on PBS or in National Geographic or anywhere without the person making some comment along the way about what we could learn from these people. And here's these people, they're naked or they're wearing a Baby Ruth wrapper and a rubber band. I was going to say around their privates, but I guess it's around their semi-privates because it's not all that private. There they are, they're sucking on bark and eating dirt. And it turns out that once a year they kill half their neighbors and their kinfolks. And here's this guy from England, speaking with that nice British accent that it seems to really impress Americans. And here the guy is, and just kind of in passing. When you're laughing, you know it's true because they cannot resist. It's so usual you don't even notice it anymore. It's almost like the guy saying, well, or coughing, because sometime along the way the show may be based on him trying to find some missing bird that they haven't seen in 10 years. But along the way he'll say something after it's been pointed out that these people are almost wild animals, and the guy will stand there, or at least his voiceover will say something about what we could learn from these people. Which see, now once I put it that way, you got to admit, if you got something to learn from those people, you got your head up the end of your own. It's up the end of your own nervous system at the other end. You do not have your head stuck up your head. But at any rate, I was going to try to get you to see from another way why there is this great intrigue. Because what it seems to be, if I were to attack an ordinary intellect in such a way and talk to them this way, I might get them to say, yeah, part of the interest is they do not seem to be as tied to secondary activities. The veneer seems to be missing. There's such things as social rank. They're all sitting around naked. They don't have any houses. Boy, wouldn't that be great? Well, no. Let me speak for ordinary intelligence again. Not that they kill each other and they're having to eat dirt and suck on bark, but it's the guy said, well, I didn't mean all that. That's easy to take a shot. What I meant was, look at them, they live closer to nature. They live closer to what they are and what he's really saying. What an ordinary intellect will be saying is not only some of the more, they might say, superficial aspects of civilized life, but they are apparently not caught up into the secondary manifestations of the pack instinct. That none of them have much. They do not have any permanent housing, and so they sit there and they treat each other as equals. There is not that kind of odious social concern about social position. That's not true. I'm not going to stop. This was really just a little catch-up intro. But all of you should know. And it even gets into modern times. People are fascinated. Surely you can see this. One that keeps popping up in our lifetime, the Amish here in this country. Somebody will go out there to do something about the great ways they paint their barns or do quilts. And along the way, and here it is, these people, you know who the Amish are in Pennsylvania and around there. You know, they don't have electricity and they won't cut their beards or they won't get haircuts or they won't take baths or whatever it is. They won't have automobiles. And the guy will say, again in passing, but this seems to be somewhat removed from these really almost feral people sitting around, you know, sucking bark, but there's an intrigue to the Amish, just using them for an example, because they seem to be less tied up, and again I'm using ordinary terminology, their kind of view, with a kind of egotistical, driven social strata. They all dress alike, everybody dresses in black, nobody has a car, and people do not try to best their neighbors, they don't try to show off, and it's not true. You do know that inside, the people sitting around the campfire sucking on bark, wearing candy, the Amish, everybody, inside that structure is a social strata. There is. If nothing else, whether they verbalize this way or not, you'll surely hear me, they are struggling over who's the plainest and who's the most humble. And that's not just cynicism, that's not irony. Remember, that's life, which is what irony is. You can forget Paul Anka and his theme song for Sinatra. That's life. They should have added, if they want to make the song really fly in Vegas and everywhere else, is irony was the punchline. And it's not some cynicism, but there is an internal structure. There is nothing, if the intellect is talking, which it is to everyone on this planet, there is no such thing as a structure. There is no such thing as a secondary world, which is everywhere now to some degree, without those kinds of internal structures, without the fighting for social position, no matter what they call it, and no matter that a guy from England may look upon these people out in the woods and say, well, they're not like us. I'm over there having to publish every year. People are trying to take away my tenure. I've got guys I used to teach back in Oxford are now out here in the field bad-mouthing me, trying to take over my reputation. And at least, look at those people. They don't have ulcers. They're not having to deal with this. They got ulcers, but it's over there. You know, don't know whether they got enough to eat tomorrow. There is no freedom from that. And I just wanted to point that out to you. Also, to shave it a little more, this is also a part, one view, of the historical, forever appearances of Mardi Gras, the apparent time out from the secondary veneer. It can be put several ways, but I just wanted to let you see that there are examples right before your eyes that makes my little story about this fictitious place, we'll assume it's fictitious, where once a month they allow the people, life allows the people to fully, without any struggle, no conversation, no debate, to see clearly the primary motivations, energies, and drives behind all of their secondary activity, which the more civilized you are, in a sense, the more civilized you are, the more your activities are secondary. That is, no intrinsic value. It's not an attack on it, but it's just not. From the view of how they are simply flowering out from primary drives. Now we're up to date. And tired as hell. Now here we go. All right, first paragraph. I wanted all of you to join in, I'll join in, and to welcome a new terpsichorean partner to the good old triaxial tango, good old C, D, and E forces, and etc. I think the time has come to mention this. And it's so complex, I thought I'd do it here since we're taping this on Friday, and I'll probably not mention it again. That's always the way out when things are so sticky, so potentially and long-range dicey. The tentacles are just everywhere that, assuming that you were picking up on it, it could be talked about for a long time. Other than do that, is a lot of times I like to say these for Friday, although I've never mentioned it, assuming that whatever is said on Friday, that's the end of it. So you see, that's always, in case you want to make your own route out of that, if there's something that is so, you just get an immediate glimpse that this is so potentially long range, it has ramifications touching everything, that you might be here thinking about this line. You may be having sex with this idea, if you recall, copulating with this great idea for a long time. Then the other alternative, another way to deal with it is, that being the case, I'll go to bed with it one time for about 20 minutes and that's it. So here we go. It's the new partner, one that's never been mentioned. Well, I sort of mentioned it last time, which I guess is why I went ahead and weakened. It is another dance partner. Not the C, as we've been calling the C, like the constructive, all that relatively speaking in the 3D world, which is the only way we can describe the 3D world. The C, D, and E forces of constructive, then the resistance, and then at any particular instance what appears to be the E force of the presently uninvolved, the indifferent, the E pool, the background. There is another force, and since I made up C, D, and E force, it took me a long time to do that, so I gave the same sort of effort. And here's the name of this new dancer, the one that I'm going to use, and it is called the silence force. And it is indeed a force, but I assume that many of you can recall that you had some difficulty, even though it literally, rhetorically made sense, of trying to deal for a while with the fact of C, D, and E, or just talking about three forces driving everything. But there's a fourth one, which the ordinary intellect would never conceive of, and if you'll follow some of this, perhaps you'll see why it would have never conceived of it and what it implies. That all sounds too logical. Scrap all that and we'll just go on. I mean, don't take that as being a preface like, well, wait a minute, maybe I'll outline this and this is actually going to make sense. Give me a break. First note, in the ordinary world, just everyday affairs, change is noisy. It is. Change is noisy. Growth is noisy. I'm using all this synonymously. Expansion of life is noisy. Well, if we were not dealing with a secondary world where man is expanding here, if we were dealing with a primary world, the primary world is not noisy. Well, we would not be talking about what we're doing, about change. At the ordinary level, change is very noisy. But if you had a more complex view, if you could get away from this planet, if you could get away from the 3D world, and then look, then your view would have to include the silence force. For instance, in the secondary world, the ordinary intellect says such things as this and fully accepts it, and who are we to say it's not true? The ordinary intellect, all the way from just ordinary people to the cutting edge of city science and the scientists, would say that you cannot understand something until you can explain it, which is just a variation of the one aspect of the scientific method. But even ordinary people outside of the science would say, if you actually understand something, or to understand it, you've got to be able to explain it, or you don't understand it. All right? Seems fair enough. Which is another way, by the way, of saying if you can't talk about something, you can't talk about it. Which is no sarcasm, that's a fact. That is a fact in the city, Jack. But also note, it is an accepted given throughout history, right up until today. Accepted in science, more or less, if pushed, and especially outside of science, hard science. It is an accepted given that there are some things that men either cannot understand and very likely will never understand. I mean, even scientifically, if the Big Bang Theory, as it's called, could be conclusively proven to the satisfaction of scientists in the city, and you got to realize they're still left with, if they're going to say that the Big Bang finally came from the little pop, and they could mathematically or theoretically prove it, they're always left with, where'd the Big Bang, the little pop come from? And they have to say, give us a break. It's the nature not of the Big Bang, not of the universe. They just don't realize it. It's the nature of this. So keep in mind, I assume you followed, that at all ordinary levels of the intellect, it's a fact, it is an operational certainty that you do not understand something. You or anyone, collectively, individually, humanity does not understand something unless it can explain it. And I'm not whittling away with a pocket knife of explain it. I don't mean to everyone's satisfaction, but to your satisfaction, to some collective group, to some institution. You have got to be able to explain it, to talk about it. Don't get hung up on explaining. You have got to talk about it in some kind of reasonable fashion. That, in conjunction with finger number 2, that there are some things, even of areas that we seem to, ordinary intelligence, seem to have a great, darn near comprehensive understanding, and yet there are always going to be some aspects that will never be understood. Science, all the way from Aristotle right up until today, they're still saying, well, maybe we will find a unified theory, but methinks, some physicists talk like that, methinks that we'll never absolutely be able to explain every little iota of the nature of the universe. So you got me. That ordinary intellect will say, given the opportunity, presented in a certain way, will admit, insist that yes, a human does not understand something unless he can explain it in some way. And they'd say, okay, give me the second finger again. And yet, there are some aspects of everything that we'll admit, or at least we suspect we'll never understand. All right. Put your finger to your lips like this and look curious. Look, if not expectant. Start at the second finger. What if everybody from scientist to your uncle, to your mother, to a rabbi, a priest, says, we believe that there are certain things, or certain aspects of things at least, that man will never understand. What if it's simply because of this? That if you had the ordinary intellect working at absolute top speed at the secondary level, even taking into account in some way what we've been describing as the three forces, what if beyond that is what I am telling you is the silence force, and no amount of 3D intelligence will ever pick it up. And so all of these ideas, these metaphysical theories, or if there's such a thing as a metaphysical certainty, I'm sure somebody would say there is, about things we'll never know because the gods don't want us to, or things we never know because the examination, if we get away from metaphysics, the examination process itself interferes with that which we're examining, and thus the closer we get into the subatomic world, in a sense, the further we get away from the actual basis of reality. All right, all of that's a nice intellectual hobby. But what if it's simply that there is a silent factor? Silent. And thus it can never be put into any equation. Its basis is not one of the three forces hiding, getting behind the door and trying It's an actual force, but the force I want tonight to refer to it as the silence force, which is, any of you wondering why I don't say silent force or whether I'm making a mistake? No, that could be, but not here. I meant to say silence force, and I did. And is anybody going to wonder, is that good English? Can you actually say that? I just said it. Because I am now President of the United States, and I don't have to use good English or eat my broccoli. The silence force. Not some other aspect of life, not something hiding, not from us, go back to a more strict scientific sense, that in some way we're looking at something, magnetism, looking at certain quirks in the quarks, and thinking, well, there's something we're not seeing, if we just get to it. What if it's none of that? That is, that there's some aspect of what we can comprehend that we're not comprehending? That may be. In fact, it's always got to be in the secondary world for things to apparently continue to unfold. But the idea that there are things we'll never understand based upon, as they would be wont to put it if I allowed them, push them, there are aspects that we may never understand, but it's on the basis that there are certain parts of what we do understand or can see or can examine. There are certain parts that simply won't reveal themselves or we don't have the technology to see it. And that's a fine answer. I mean, that's as good as saying, well, God did it. Except when scientists say it, it doesn't sound quite as old-fashioned. But what if it's not that? That there is another force outside of anything that science is ever going to come up with, or three-dimensional intelligence, and it is the silence force. All right, we'll say it again. If that were true, wouldn't that explain a whole lot of very attractive waterfront lots? Let me explain a lot of those lots. In fact, some of them are not just waterfront. I mean, they're so close, they're kind of under the... Which I've heard that some people find fault with that, but if you're going to talk about a waterfront lot, we're talking about serious waterfront lots. These are not just up on the edge where the waves can just barely get to them. We're talking about serious lots, very attractive lots. Wouldn't that explain a lot of them? I don't know. Consider a possible connection between that, not necessarily the waterfront lots, but that referring to supra, in conjunction with the fact that it's only the secondary that has to define, has to explain, and has to defend itself. Only that. We have mentioned this, little bits of it in passing, but there is a specific possible connection outside sequential linkage. If you just keep in mind, first to start with, if indeed in some way we could talk about humans operating simply at a primary level, which we can do, although it doesn't seem to be operationally feasible for it to happen. But if you were in some way more or less what you are now, and at the same time could operate on the basis, rather than being involved with romance or some secondary version of sex, you're involved strictly with sex, back at the level where your involvement, your drive sexually was not much different, not much more civilized, not much less civilized than your friend the beaver or the muskox. Let's just take that for an example. You do understand that, well, first off, the obvious again, that a beaver does not apologize for its sexual drive. It has no sexual mores, and everybody knows that. It's not a perfect parallel. I knew somebody would say that. They've got no apology. If everything was still equal and that you were more or less what you are, still a thinking, talking Homo sapien, but in some way, let's just take sex as one thing, that in some way you could just operate on a sexual basis and the rest of the secondary aspects of sex were stripped from you. That this once a month in my fictitious place actually happened to you all the time in that one area. Just hear this because there's a point. Not that I may try to make for you, but on that basis, sex would never define itself, never explain itself, and never defend itself. No matter what happened, any more than if you went up and you said, naughty beaver. Now, I remember you from last year because I remember those particular markings, and you were living, I remember that nice woman beaver, I thought you guys were married, and you were living on that other pond, and now I see you over here, and that's not the same one, and that's not the way we, at least us Baptists, do things. You know, naughty, bad beaver. Now, you do know, surely, the beaver is not going to be overcome with guilt. Or in some way, if a beaver could talk to us, go, wait a minute, I know what you're thinking. I know what... Which, of course, I guess might say something about your level of intelligence, if that were true, that a beaver met you and said, hey, well, never mind. I'm sure we don't think about that. Point is not beavers, is that at primary levels, if it could still be true and you were still secondarily civilized enough that you could have it both ways and see it, sex, that is, at the primary level, would not defend itself. No matter what happened, there is no defense. If you were eating just to stay alive, if we're dealing with one of the other S's of sustenance, not dining, no nothing, if we were talking about instead of sex, and you were eating, and in some way we could again strip all secondary aspects of eating from just the actual eating, not dining, but just eating. You would not be, inside of you, that kind of drive, would not be any more subject to an attack to defend yourself than you would have with my example of sex. And well, if you went to a beaver and went, I've been watching you, and you have been eating nothing but wood since I've been here, and I've got to tell you, that is the most, I don't know how you stayed alive, but that is insane. A beaver, if it could hear all this, a beaver would not say, wait a minute, I know why you're saying that, but let me explain. I mean, at least let me point out that wood is my food. Don't write me, I know beavers don't eat wood. But at any rate, there would not even be the desire. It would not. In the same way, you would not if in some way you were just dealing with, I want to stay alive. Or if you want to take one of these ridiculous examples, you've been through the desert, and some way you were still had enough water, but you were starving to death, and suddenly you come upon an area, something just atrocious. Like a 3-week-old used Big Mac or something. And you just fell upon it, as they used to in biblical times, and you fell upon it. And then I guess being as intelligent as you are, you realize just laying on this burger is not going, so you got up, and anyway, and so then you ate it, and suddenly somebody jumped out of the bushes. Julia Childs. And made some pejorative comment about your taste in food, or even your etiquette, if it was mismanners. You do realize, at that basis, if in some way you were just eating, can you imagine that you would stop eating, that you were about to die, and you're eating actually hoping that this one thing might keep me alive, that you're going to stop and say, wait a minute, let me explain to you, I've been real hungry. No. All right, back to where we started, this paragraph. It is only the secondary that must defend itself. That really covers it. I was just trying to give you, remember the skinny dip version. But if it helps, you can add that it's only a secondary that will explain, define, and defend itself. That is, will tell you what kind of guy it is, tell you what it's doing, and of course, anytime you'll say what kind of guy you are, in case some of you hadn't figured out, you're already going to defend yourself. You cannot, however, if you're going to explain yourself, if you're going to define what you do, you are some drive, some force of energy that could talk. If it will explain, if it will attempt to define itself, that is, tell what kind of guy it is, once it does that, you don't have to say, well, I wonder if it'll defend itself. It's got no choice because it has to do with the flow of energy. Once it does that, it will do the second. Once it will explain itself, once it will identify itself, define itself, it will defend itself. Of course, those that are really good, any word will defend itself. That's why all words have synonyms and antonyms. They have friends, and then they're polarized, and they've got antonyms, which are their enemies. Anything that will define itself will defend itself. Which also, as a side, I hate to insinuate that I know a lot of real secrets here from this planet, but I suggest to you that's one reason beavers won't talk. You know, if you say, why in the world do you do this and mess up my trees back here and dam up my pond? See, if a beaver ever said, all right, wait a minute. I know why you people get excited about this, but let me tell you what's driving us beavers. Let me tell you what kind of beaver I am. If it ever did that, it's got no choice. It's not psychological. That's the kindergarten dress-up version. But once a beaver will explain itself, define what drives it, what kind of beaver it is, then to say, I wonder if it'll defend itself. You've got no choice. If you will describe what you are, then you'll defend yourself. Let's try to get back on the main highway yet again, if you recall where we were. It's only the secondary that must explain, define, and defend itself in polarized terms, which, if any of you get good, that always goes without saying once you understand it, which all defense, all explanations are polarized terms. While if we could separate, which I can do verbally, the silence force, it would have none of that. It would be beyond any explanation, definition, or defense of itself. Not just because it's silence. Don't say that that's self-evident. It would be beyond that. It would specifically be beyond that, in that the silence force could not be a part of ordinary polarity. It would be, don't wait for a punchline, I think I'm just going to leave this with you, it's going to get sticky. But you can hear this, it'll sound like a little punchline. The silence force brought into 3D vistas, so that I can talk about it, would be neither positive, negative, or indifferent. See, some of you thought you knew. Nah. Some of you were intellectuals taking a nap and you were expecting to hear, that'd be like we're still talking about the E-force. And so, well, the thing about the E-force is, what makes it tricky, it is neither positive nor negative. It's neither. The silence force, neither positive, negative, nor indifferent. My full wrap-up is to say it would just be, which is to defame it already for me to even say that. But if you would like to try and consider it, or I wouldn't have brought it up, it is not just beyond, or it's not just not positive or negative, it's also not indifferent. The operations, we'll consider it, we've dropped that. The operations of the secondary world, ordinary human life, even at its most advanced frontiers in the city, even where people continue, as God intended, to make hand gestures. The city, the secondary world, if you will notice, doesn't even seem to care much for silence. I mean, even without having ever heard of, and probably never will hear of, our silence force, just in general, in the general operations of human life, there's not much concern, there's not much toleration. Life just doesn't seem to much care for silence. Now, I'll point out to you, whether it seemed to made all that much sense at the time, that all change in the three-dimensional sense is noisy. Try an equation. Much intelligence equals much civilization. let's start there, equals much talk. You cannot have civilization without talk. And of course, talk is non-silence. Talk is, back to the 3D world, I'm trying to give you a springboard, is a polarization of silence. But you know you can't have civilization no matter what happened. The intellect could not, you cannot have a group somewhere, a city somewhere, a tribe somewhere, that their little brains had reached in some way the level, they're all individual Einsteins, and none of them talked, they'd still be sitting around wearing Baby Ruth wrappers and sucking on bark. You cannot have the secondary world without talk. And it's just a fact. You might as well, it's not that hard to see. Other than the fact that some ordinary intelligence might say, wait a minute, you can't prove that. There is, we'll agree, there is a serious amount of coincidence that every civilization we know about, they talked, but you can't prove it. I hate to have to lapse back to the level of Aristotle and Plato, but it was good enough for them, to their critics. They went, in case you didn't know it, somewhere a guy in the 20th century, and they tried to take credit for it in the northeastern corridor of the United States and call it the Bronx chair. It used to be known as the Aristotle chair. When he pointed out things like there are three forces in the world, you know, there's air, water, and green beans, and his critics, people just tried to tear him apart. And sometimes he would deal with them and respond, and then other times he'd just finally go, so I'm in good company. Back to the equation, I want you to see, I'm leading up to a little something, that it is really serious if you think about it a second. That it's easy, we've apparently done it, which we didn't, but out in life, you're all the time hearing parts of life's body saying that everybody else yammers too much, that there's too much just mechanical talk, we're getting talk pollution. I mean, damn TVs, radios, people stand on street corners, somebody pull out on their porch, a couch, and sit down, and it's like they're doing a talk show and call over strangers, and everybody just talks about nothing. You know, yeah. But it is what I started out with this subparagraph. It is almost as though life doesn't like silence. Not in the civilized world, not in the secondary world. Now, if we're talking about areas where there is no secondary, and you're talking about out in the jungle, other than the kind of background noise and birds and the rustling of leaves, you do not find elephants, lions laying around in herds or in packs, talking, attempting to talk. They only seem to make signals that's just at the absolute primary level of just to keep them alive, that maybe want to make a noise, and perhaps the rest of the herd and realizes, look around. Maybe an insurance salesman catching up on them. He's trying to give some kind of warning. It is almost, in the secondary world now, remember, it's almost as though life doesn't like silence. Put another way, it's almost as though civilized men do not like silence. It's almost as though, are you ready, that silence is too abrupt. That's the nude version, so we can talk about it a little bit and swim around in the mire. The long version. It's almost as though silence is too close to being abrupt. First version's always the best, the stripped one. But for those of you that need power steering, there it is. AT and AC. The thing is, everybody knows the word abrupt. Basically means, I'm going to expand it a little bit to save time, because this is what it actually means. I'm going to throw in my own adjectives perhaps, but it means totally unexpected, completely unforeseen. Just abrupt, just something, it just happens. It's in the dictionary. Everybody uses the word, or you have sometime. People say, well, that was too abrupt. But it means unexpected, no warning, not foreseen, sudden. But the part I want you to latch on to, even if the dictionary doesn't take it this far, I can't think of a better synonym. It's got to be right at the rhetorical cutting edge. And so if we tried to question ordinary intellects, yours, other people, institutional intellects, and said, all right, abrupt, in the real sense of it being unexpected, just something happens. We're talking about something that there was no warning. It just, out of the blue. I mean, that's what abrupt means in the real sense, or I don't know a stronger word. People say yes. But there's no such thing as abrupt. There's no such thing that is totally unconnected with anything else. Now, everybody, you've got to know that by now. There is no such animal. It is not possible. If it were, you would have indeed new energy, new matter, suddenly created. But now, of course, the ordinary intellect could say, well, what I meant was, I guess in some theoretical way everything's connected, but I had no preparation for this. I cannot see any valid reason. I can't see any moral, scientific, logical background for this. It just up and happened. There is no such creature. And they might say, oh, well, I know what you're saying, maybe, that something may have affected it. It is tied to, I suggest to you, the silence force. When I say that life does not, could be said to almost observably, does not like in the secondary world silence, and then for me to say that it's almost as though it were too abrupt, and then to point out that abruptness does not actually exist. Look at it this way, that the whole idea of abrupt is a verbal attempt to reach, to define, ultimately, processes into things specific. And the reason I'm suggesting that life does not like silence, and to consider this little non-sequential sequence a little further, and then life does not like even the idea of abruptness, or else it'd let the word, it had to be another word that actually meant that, which this one doesn't. Because if there were such a thing as true abruptness, you would have a final break, at least in some process somewhere. And I mean a break that did not simply reverse the polarity of what was going on, or merge and disappear into a modulation. You would have an absolute break. In other words, you would have a true death. You would have processes, or a process, it should be plural, but if this helps you, you would have some process that literally, no exception, nothing else to say, it would become silent itself, because the silence force would have stepped in and become visible and audible at our level, that a process would have literally been turned into a thing specific, because that would be the closest thing that ever happened in the 3D world to an abruptness, would be a thing specific, or polarize it. The closest thing to a true thing specific that we've already been through, that some of you called on a different night, that that's not true. There's no such thing as a thing specific. It's just the intellect acting like a cookie cutter for this infinitely universal piece of dough, and it just hits it one time and says, oh, that's so-and-so. That's a thing specific. That's the way the intellect has to be. But a thing specific would be, I'm reversing, just polarizing, reversing the polarization. A thing specific would be the only real example of the abrupt. Because it would have been literally cut asunder, cut loose from all processes, from even the process from whence it seemed to have cometh, or that it seemed to have been connected to. And notice, if you would now, why I was sort of rhetorically being cute in saying I was suggesting, or pointing out that it seemed as though life doesn't even care much for silence. Not in the secondary sense, not with humans. But see what it would be if silence in some way had just at the 3D level, had an operational wherewithal, a purpose in expansion then it would be possible for abruptness to actually exist. That is, that suddenly, without warning, totally unexpectedly, out of the friggin' blue, something did happen. That would be a thing specific. Don't wait for a meteor. Don't wait for Aristotle or Jesus or Moses to come again and say, boy, I didn't expect that. Or Cardinal Fang. What is not expected? The one thing that would truly be abrupt, that the whole world, or you could say, wow, I didn't expect that. Everything else is just funny money not expected. If there was truly a thing specific, actually suddenly happened, that would be where an ordinary intellect, individual or collectively, could correctly say, ooh, boy, I didn't expect that. That's abrupt. And all it would be for the first time that a human had actually seen a thing specific, not a process cut by the intellect, by the three-dimensional intellect. The whole thing about abrupt, I'm saying the whole thing to kind of push us along here at the end, the whole thing about being abrupt, about the silence force, and how abruptness does not actually exist. There is no such thing as abrupt. I know there's a word, and I know what people, you should have seen what I was using examples, what ordinary intellect means by abrupt, but there is no such thing. It would have to drop from another dimension and become sensually known to the ordinary intellect. That would be abrupt. It's almost, the little partial rap I was going to give, it's almost as though life does not want man's whittle whiny to have to deal with this. All right. It's as though life understands that man's intelligence could not deal with it. And for those of you that really like to wonder the universe in your own brain, it happens that people apparently have had to deal with it. But may our ancestors and decent Hawaiian musicians protect us. If you can suddenly think of examples when it seems to have happened in history, what in God's name, so to speak, did they make out of it when something abruptly did seem to happen? That some person here and there seemed to have experienced something truly abrupt. But I have to tell you, it ended up being wallpaper on the landscape of man's intellectual history that I suggest was far removed from the experience. But it becomes many times quite popular over eons, the same way as beige is so dearly loved by the masses. But what I'm suggesting is the beige, the muzak, in many cases, was an abrupt, an almost real anomaly to somebody, that they were faced with almost a real thing specific, almost a break in the ordinary processes, that they almost, I'm giving you a way out, that they almost actually experienced an abruptness. But just as being what it is, I'm also suggesting, if any of you can maybe figure out what I'm hinting at, that the abruptness, this example that I'm saying might have been possible, that would be truly unique, becomes what? It becomes the antipathy of uniqueness, is what I was suggesting by beige, muzak, that which was abrupt, possibly, and truly a singular break in the processes, that actually a thing specific jumped out of the bushes in front of somebody, and it turned into what? The most innocuous of recollections, of retellings, of energy transfers. Yes, we have something exciting, dangerous, life-changing to tell you. Well, I'm here, tell me. And they tell you. And what is it? And we've already covered the greatest, I thought, example, or most stinging example for ordinary intelligence, that if the big anthropomorphic God himself showed up to tell you, to give you the ultimate abruptness, what would it be? It would be, he'd say, "Baise thy neighbor." Love your muzak as yourself. And for a second, people, since they'd come that far to hear the old man, they would all go, "Wow!" You know, like, you're not going to admit that I traveled halfway around the world to hear this. And everybody go, "Wow!" You know, we've been through this. And then you go, "I kind of knew that." It has to become beige. It will become beige. It will become background music, if indeed somebody did experience an abruptness. It is not an everyday affair. The processes of life would indeed be cut up permanently. Things would become things specific. It would not be just the intellect's way in which to have to count out the currency, how to keep score, how to measure the things, the processes. Instead of it being the continuing fabric or dough of the universe, you'd cut it up into little petit fours, little cookies, and they would actually be cookies. And that'd be the end of them. Well, they could be transferred again, I know. But that would be the end of where it was in the fabric. The damn thing had been cut out, and you could take it and leave, assuming there's somewhere to go besides the great cutting board. Should we even say any more about it? Well, we got a few minutes. Let me point out, this is the kind of thing that we can even get stickier since it's a tail end. If it's been too sticky, has it been as sticky for you as it has for me? Never mind then. A little something I mentioned just on the way, but this is really sticky. Those of you that's had enough of the stickiness, you know, I guess roll over and light a cigarette and ignore this last few minutes. The word abruptness, I'm sure the definition is something like suddenly, unexpected. And I was pointing out that, you know, there's no such thing, and that even some of you, or even ordinary intelligence, as I said, could say, "Well, you're right, that everything in some way is vaguely connected." On top of that, see if you can get a glimpse of this. Why is it I get ordinary intelligence? I assume that you agree what I'm saying. I could take an ordinary intelligent man and say, is the definition, or we could look it up, and the dictionary says, unexpected, no warning. And I said, hey, now somebody could say that something abrupt happened to them. My wife I came home, and my wife was gone. The note says, you know, I don't know how to spell that, but you know, she said, if I knew how to spell it, my farewell message to you, Hubert, is, and he could say, it was unexpected. I went to work, I thought everything was fine. Now, and so we said, look, that can't be true. Now think about it. Hadn't she acted a little weird lately? And finally, for somebody to say, well, yeah, I guess so. Maybe I just didn't pick up on it. Do you understand that people, ordinary people, would finally say, yeah, I guess in a way there is no such thing as actually, totally, completely, unconditionally unexpected. And here's the even stickier part. If that's so, then why does the damn word in the dictionary say that? And it's not just that word. I could pick on all kinds of words. But notice I could get ordinary intelligence to say, you're right. To take the definition of abrupt, and I've used it myself. In fact, I was saying, perhaps the guy said, that's when I jumped out of the bushes into his brain, that he was saying, I got home and talk about an abrupt shock. I mean, I could come home, my house on fire or something. I wouldn't be surprised. Well, but my wife was gone. And we have our little conversation, and he would have to say, well, you're right, it wasn't abrupt, not in that sense. Maybe I didn't catch all the telltale signs, but I cannot live with that word now that you pointed out. You know, I wish you'd go away. I got to go get drunk and wring my hands about my wife. But since you pointed out, yeah, it couldn't be totally unexpected. And then if I said, if I was so foolish, to say, well, why do people say abrupt when it took me all of 10 or 15 seconds to get you to admit that, yeah, there is no such thing as totally unexpected? You follow what I'm getting at, or is it getting too sticky? That I could get an ordinary intellect to admit, all right, you're right, that word represents something that is, at best, specious. I mean, we use it, and I know what people think they mean, but once you point out, you're right, there is no such thing as abrupt. There is nothing that is actually unexpected. There's no such thing as something that has no connection, that gives no warning. But then I couldn't say, well, why do people use it? And it's not just that word, but why do they do that? Any of you who really like stickiness, I'll give you a third sticky one. Another level. Why does not life have a word that actually means that? In other words, how about a five-dimensional abruptness? Why can't you look up abrupt and it says maybe either in life's genetic body, in your brain, in a dictionary for those of you of more childish intellectual wherewithal right this second. Why can't you look in the dictionary and it says abrupt? Definition, sudden, without warning, unexpected. And in parentheses maybe it says, this is the ordinary three-dimensional useful definition. And it says, look in epilogue, page number X1111VVXNMC or something. In the back, for those of you of more complex interest. And then you look in the back, and it says, well, if you look back here, I'm quoting what it says, sick. It says, if you look back here, it means that you understand there is actually no such thing as abrupt. Not in the sense of being totally unexpected. And so since you know that, then you see the possibility that it does have a greater complexity to it. And so there is an actual abruptness, but it wouldn't be at the 3D levels. And so here's the real word you were looking for, as sharp as you are, and it gives you the word. How come it's not there? I mean, since I could get ordinary intelligence, which we're talking about life's intelligence, to admit, wait a minute, you're lying to us, or this is misleading, there is no such thing as abrupt. And life goes, all right, you caught me. And so it's bad enough that you got to sing that, but what's the real word? Why hadn't you ever told at least the real word to put it out so that people who see through this could go, well, at least I know what the real word is. You didn't like that? All right. Fourth level. There ain't no fourth level.